Matthew Dix is my guest today. Matthew is an internationally best-selling author. He's the author of 7 novels, which have been translated into 25 languages. He is a storytelling champion, a master storyteller, and he's the author of a book that really changed me. It's a book that made me start a podcast, a book that made me start this YouTube channel, that made me start a blog, and even inspired me to write my own book. I'm talking about Storyworthy, Engage, Teach, Persuade, and Change Your Life Through the Power of Storytelling. I cannot think of a better person to discuss creativity, storytelling, and writing. I hope you will enjoy this conversation. Get ready now. It's story time. Matthew, it's an honor to meet you, and thank you for accepting this invitation to speak to me today.
My pleasure. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
You wrote a book that I've talked about your book on my channels for 2 years, 3 years now since I read it in 2021. I'm talking about Storyworthy, of course.
Yep.
It's a book that changed my life without no exaggeration. I've told this many times. I opened a book club even to read it with my students, to teach them storytelling. And I wanted to ask you, why did you write that book? This is the first big question. I know that you've answered this question elsewhere, but why did you write it?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. So, every time I'm asked it, I may give a different reason. But, I think my initial thought was a lot of people wanted to learn what I was teaching. And, they couldn't always come to Connecticut to see me. I did a workshop, a week-long workshop here in Connecticut one summer, probably around 2016, maybe just before I started writing the book. And in that workshop of 10 people, 2 people from China, a person from British Columbia, a person from San Diego, 2 people from Chicago, people flew really far away to come to Connecticut where there's nothing to do. There's literally nothing. So once you arrive here for a week, it's me and that's it. And so, during that week, it occurred to me, people should not have to fly 3,000 miles to, learn how to tell a story. So I thought to myself, I'm going to write the book so that if you can't come to me, I can sort of come to you. My initial vision of the book was, if you spend a week with me, here's what you would get. Now, it became a little more than that for sure. But that was the original plan, was let's allow people to learn how to tell stories without having to come see me in order to do so.
Okay. Which is a similar reason to the other book that you wrote, Some Days Today, because you say, people ask me about productivity and they cannot spend, 14 hours with me. So I need to write a book.
Yes, that book is designed to answer the question I'm asked the most, which is, how do you get all the things done that you get done? When I get asked that question, I never feel like I can adequately answer it in less than sort of 18, 20 hours. And so I wrote a book to answer that question.
We'll get to that later.
Sure.
I want to stay with storytelling.
Yep.
Why do we need to tell better stories? So you wrote that book, so that people can read it, in Italy, like I did. But why, what was your vision? Did you have a vision? People should tell better stories?
Well, I knew that in telling stories, in telling better stories, the way I tell stories, I saw the benefits to my life and to other people's lives, both in terms of just sort of understanding yourself and your life better, even if you never want to speak to anyone in your life, and then connecting with people, convincing people, being a better parent who can get your children to do the things you want them to do, to be a better teacher. I was teaching storytelling for dating, people who couldn't get dates without learning what to say properly. So I saw all the enormous benefits to me in terms of being able to tell good stories. I mean, my wife was once asked in my presence, when did you first fall in love with Matt? And sadly, it was not the way I look. She said it was basically, he told me some stories about his life over dinner one night, and I realized this guy's different than anyone I've ever met. And she immediately felt connected to me. And so my hope was that people would see those reasons why, whether they want to understand themselves better, connect with other people, get more dates, be better in job interviews. Storytelling can help you in every aspect of your life. And so I think that's why we have to do it.
I see. There's a question. I collected some questions. I asked my audience. I'm going to interview Matthew Dix. So he is this master storyteller, and he's a writer, because there are many writers in my audience. And I said, let me know what questions you'd like me to ask Matt. And I've got some related to storytelling.
Sure.
What makes a story worth telling? Asks Turi, an Italian writer.
I always say that if it means something to you, then it can mean something to other people. So as long as you feel it in your heart and your mind, and it's something that moved you, even if it's small and seemingly insignificant, if it meant something to you, you can absolutely tell it in a way that will become meaningful to other people as well. So what makes a story worth telling is if you felt something, you can make other people feel something. And so it doesn't take much. I do meet many, many people who seem to believe that the things that happen to them are not worth speaking about. And I think that's probably the effect of either they're not viewing the totality of their life in a way that I'd like them to, or more likely, they're in the company of people who don't listen, are unwilling to listen, speak too much of their own stuff, and don't pay enough attention to other people. So I'm really in the business of getting people to understand that your life is filled with stories and they're worth speaking about, regardless of how small you might think they are.
This was the big change that Storyworthy brought to my life. I thought I was just another ordinary guy, which I am an ordinary guy. But Storyworthy really, like, you taught me that my life is full of stories waiting to be told. And I'd never seen my life like that. Like a small, insignificant daily event could become a story like yours, like the one that you tell on stage, which are, I've listened to all of them, and I'm still amazed by how, like, you never hesitate. Like there are no, you never hesitate. It's like it feels memorized. I mean, sorry, it's not memorized. It's like an audiobook, reading out of a script, but it's spontaneous. How did you learn how to never hesitate in your speaking? Even now, like, I hesitate a lot, even in my first language, because English is my second language. But is this a natural thing that you were born with, or I don't know, did you practice? What did you do?
Well, I spend a lot of time speaking in front of people. I've been 26 years as an elementary school teacher, 25 years as a wedding DJ. I've spent a lot of time speaking, and so there's many things I'm not very good at. But I think when I am speaking to other people, I have learned to sort of calculate ahead what is coming so that I can figure out what to say next. A lot of people use filler words. They use ums and ahs and things like that.
Yeah.
And I always say, just pause. If you were to listen to the way I've been speaking for, the last 10 minutes, you'll hear some pauses that you don't really notice because they're small. And when I pause, I'm either choosing a word or I'm choosing a direction I want to take. So when you asked me initially, sort of, why did I write Storyworthy? There are a few reasons that I can talk about in terms of why I did that. Oftentimes we have more than one reason to do something. And I'm sure at some point, as I was getting ready to answer that question, I paused because I saw sort of three roads I could take, and I chose the one I wanted to talk about today. And so rather than saying or ah, or any of the other filler words that people like, I just teach people to speak slower and to pause and allow yourself to consider what you want to say next. I think sometimes people see silence as a problem. They see it as something we want to avoid, and silence, there's beautiful. It's a wonderful thing. It allows an audience to process what you've just said. It's much better than the filler words, which you can get rid of. You can train yourself to just sort of, rather than saying just say nothing. And that's often much more effective.
Silence in some cultures, like in Japan, silence is like it's fine. But in the West, Like you get asked a question and you immediately have to respond. There's no room for silence. I agree. What's the best way to get the message across through a story? This is another question from the same person.
Sure.
So.
Well, I mean, ideally, you know what you're going to be talking about before you open your mouth. That is really important. You can't really tell a story unless you know where you're aiming at, what your landing zone is, what you're trying to say. Most people don't speak that way, though. Most people open their mouth and begin talking about something that happened to them, and sometimes they get lucky enough to land in a place of meaning, and oftentimes they don't, and essentially what they do is they report on their life. They just tell you some stuff that happened in the order that it happened, and it kind of goes nowhere. You know what happened to them, but you're never going to remember it because you didn't have anything in the head and the heart at the end. So, if you want to tell an excellent story, you should probably know where you're going. Now, that doesn't apply to fiction. When I write a novel, I have no idea where I'm going. A novel starts with a question for me, a what if. But that's okay because I can make stuff up in a novel. I get to invent. And so finding the end for me is the act of invention. But when I'm telling a true story or a story for a business or, teaching my students a lesson and I'm incorporating part of my life or part of their lives, I have to stick to the truth. I really love that part of storytelling. I love the puzzle aspect of it. I'm trapped with facts and I have to choose which facts and what order they're going to be told in and what's going to be left out. I love that about it. But I always have to know what I'm ultimately trying to say first. And so, if you don't do that, it's the equivalent of sort of getting in a plane, getting up into the air, and then deciding where you're going to go. That's a bad plan. You make your plan before you take the plane off, and that's the way we want to tell stories. So I'm always thinking about what am I actually trying to say through this story, and that's sort of the beginning point for me.
And we've been talking about sorry, there's a filler word there, about oral stories.
Yes.
Right? Oral stories. What about written stories? Because can we use them in our lives as well? Because I write a lot on platforms like on Medium, on my blog. I have a Substack newsletter. I'm writing a little book. I wrote another one before. So where do you see the place of written stories? What's the place of written stories in our lives?
Probably just as useful and powerful. I've written a blog post every single day for almost 20 years. On December 14th, I will hit 20 years without ever missing a day. Many of those posts are stories about my life, things that I'm thinking, thoughts that I've had, opinions that I share. So I believe there's a powerful and important place for the written story, of course. I also write a newsletter frequently. I actually have a business partner, and the way we write our newsletter is he writes all of the sort of sales copy, and then he sends it to me and says, can you put a story at the top of it? And the story is always something personal about me that it ties into what we're selling or what we're offering or our new platform or whatever we're doing. And my open rate on emails, I didn't really understand this at the time, but right now it's around 76%. I didn't understand that was a very high number. I don't know these things, but he said that's a very high number. And when I talk to people who read my newsletter, either meeting them in person or writing to them, they always say, well, I can't not read your newsletter because the story at the beginning is always so good. So the story brings people down into the sales copy and hopefully prompts them to make a purchase or join my community or interact with me in some way, watch a story that I've told. So I think stories have an enormous power in terms of gaining people's attention, gaining their trust, entertaining them, and convincing them to do the things we want to do, whether you're trying to get elected for office or sell a product or service or, working at a nonprofit. I work with religious folks who are standing on pulpits, delivering sermons, trying to get their congregations to listen more. All of these situations, whether it's written and you're sharing it with someone or it's written and you're reading it, it's all the same thing. There are some variations in terms of oral versus written storytelling in terms of tactics, but the purposes are all the same and a lot of the strategies are the same.
Some people feel they don't have any stories to tell. Like they say, I'm not interesting. I just work and I come home. I've got a family, all this. And they feel they're not special. They feel they have nothing to say, and this it saddens me. It makes me sad, because I read Storyworthy. I was like that before. What would you? I don't know. What advice for someone who hasn't read Storyworthy? What would you tell these people?
I guess what I tell them is that your life is filled with stories, and one of two things are happening. Most likely, you're not seeing them because you're not really looking for stories. You're sort of moving through your life, and something happens that's meaningful, and you don't even see it because you're so occupied with other things. You're not taking time to notice your days, which is a tragedy. And it's a cause for a lot of sadness, I think, in the world. When people say time flies, it doesn't actually fly. The problem is we don't remember our days. So if I asked you to remember, like, how many days can you remember from the year 2021? If you're really good, you might remember 75 days with some clarity. If you're really good, most people can't even get to that number, right? So if you're remembering 75 days from 2021, the year didn't fly by. You just allowed yourself to forget about 300 of those days. You took a 365-day year and shrunk it into 75 days. Of course it feels like time flies. If I ask people what they did last Thursday, they often can't tell me what they did. It's almost as if Thursday wasn't worth living because they haven't done anything to hold on to a single moment from that day, to see it. And then in the rare instances when you do see it, when you have a real moment with someone, you even share it with someone, you often just allow it to be forgotten at that point. People walk through their lives as if their memories and the moments that they're sharing are worthless. And they leave them all behind. And then suddenly they wonder how time is gone. And, how did I get here? And how did my kid grow up so fast? None of these things actually happened. You just didn't take the time to notice. And so everyone's lives have stories. What you just described sounds like a person filled with stories. They go to work, which means they have colleagues and customers and jobs to do and problems to solve. Lots of things happen at work. And then you said they come home to a family, which means they have probably a spouse and some children. And that's all you need for stories. I have stories where I'm all by myself and I have a story to tell, and we all have a past. We all have from age 0 all the way up to what we are now. Now, we don't remember 0, 1, and 2, and 3, but I do have a story about being in kindergarten at 5. And you might have one too, So we have all the past that we can mine for stories. We have all the moments we're living right now. We're filled with stories. We're just not seeing them. And when we see them, we allow them to be forgotten.
And this is where Homework for Life, and maybe even your blog, like your blog is part of noticing things. Like for me, it is. Like when I write on my blog, it's because I've noticed something and I want to allow my self-expression. I want to self-express. I want to express myself through my blog, through writing. Is this the same for you? I guess probably it is.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between Homework for Life and my blog is Homework for Life, I want it to be for people like brushing their teeth. I want it to be quick. I want it to be easy to do. And I never want you to miss a day. If I asked you to write a blog post every single day for the next 20 years, most people will miss a day. And I understand that because writing a blog post is a commitment. It requires time. It requires effort. And not everyone has that kind of time, effort, or even desire to publish things on the internet. As someone who puts things on the internet, I can tell you I receive a lot of enormous, I receive many acts of kindness and words of kindness from people, but I also receive a lot of awfulness too. If you put things on the internet, it attracts terrible people and wonderful people. And some people aren't interested in that, and I don't need them to be. So you don't need to write every day. I don't even think you should be writing a diary entry or journal every day if you don't want to. That's not something that feels like it's necessary in order to hold on to your life. Homework for Life is, you get one cell in an Excel spreadsheet across a screen. Write down something in that cell that will remind you about the day that made this day different than every other day. And if you do it often enough, if you start committing yourself to that practice, you'll soon discover that it's not one cell you're filling anymore. It's multiple cells. If we look at my data, I did some research for my new book. People asked me about sort of the difference between my 2015 Homework for Life and my 2024 Homework for Life. And I discovered that looking back at the data, I was finding about 1.8 moments per day in 2015. In 2024, I'm now finding almost 8 moments per day.
Wow.
So 8 times as many moments. It's not because my life is more interesting. It's because I've gotten better at noticing, and I've started to recognize things that are important that I used to not see as important. Back in 2015, I was looking for stories, actual things I could stand on a stage and share. Today, I just look for anything that has meaning to me. And I don't judge whether it's going to be a story or not. I just say, I want to hold on to that. So my son says something funny. That's not a story, but I don't want to lose it. So it becomes a moment in my homework for life. I have a thought, a random thought. The other day, I was picking up my kids' crayons off the floor. They're 12 and 15, but they're still coloring. And I noticed that the brown crayon is always the longest crayon. They never use the brown crayon. And as I was picking it up, I thought, do they avoid the brown crayon because brown is the color of poop? Like, is that the reason we don't use the brown crayon, or is there something else? Are my kids not drawing black people? Are they like racist when it comes to their coloring? Like they only draw white people? I didn't know, but that thought, which will never really be a story, goes into my homework for life because it's a thought I had that I've never had before. Back in 2015, I was just looking for a story to tell. Now I'm just grabbing things that feel like they might have meaning. And when I went back and looked, because people ask, how often does something in your homework for life actually become a story or a bit in my stand-up or a blog post or something in my book? Only about 10%. 10% of the things that I write down, I actually speak aloud or write for the public in some way, which means 90% of the things I write ultimately go nowhere except I hold on to them. And they make a full year feel like a full year to me. Time does not go by quickly for me. It actually goes by miraculously slowly, probably slower than most people. Because if I'm finding 7 or 8 moments per day, that means my 365-day year is now 365 times 8. So my days feel incredibly full, and I remember them. And if I don't remember them, I have a record, a chronological record that I can go through and say, right, I did that, and I did that, and all those moments come right back to me. So it's really valuable, and I want people to just do it every day. Not a full diary entry, journal entry, blog post, but just grab things that mean something to you and write them down short and quick.
It's a way of capturing moments, meaningful moments.
Right. And then eventually some become a blog post, some become a story I tell on a stage, some enter my stand-up routine, or even in fiction. Some of the moments that I experience in my life become moments in fiction. So you might read my novel and say, wait, that happened to Matt. And I'll say, yes, it did. And now it's happening to my character in my book because it's working well here too.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about writing. Do you prefer writing fiction or nonfiction? Because you've published 7 novels and 3 nonfiction books.
Right.
So, which one do you prefer? I mean, I know it's but
it's like asking you to choose between your children, really. Yeah. It's probably just my mood is what it is. I love fiction when I am actually writing it for the first time, the act of creation. When I'm going through that book and I'm finding the story and discovering what it's going to be. Writing a story for me or writing a novel for me is often like reading the book for me. As I am writing the book, it is revealing itself to me as I'm writing it. So I love that part of it. Once I'm done with it and now I have to start editing it based upon an editor's suggestions, it becomes a lot less fun. Now it's a homework assignment. So that's not great. My nonfiction, I love writing most of the time, probably all of the time, honestly. The only time nonfiction becomes problematic for me is when people tell me I have to add like activities to a chapter, or exercises. I can't stand any of those things. I actually have my production manager sort of outline exercises at the end of chapters to help me figure out what I should have people do. So I guess in all writing, it's when other people get involved and tell me I need to do something different that it becomes less fun and more homework-like. But they're both great. I mean, I love doing both.
Yeah, but there are no, or are there? In Storyworthy, like I didn't see any exercises. Were there any exercises? Because you don't want to make a workbook, like a textbook.
Well, the new one is, though. Like I've got Story Cell came out this year, and this has exercise in it, as does Some Days Today, because when I wrote Some Days Today, people loved the exercises. I don't know why. I would never do the exercises. I'm not that kind of person, but a lot of people are. And so for the new book, I have exercises in it because that seems to be something people enjoy. And I do produce online courses and things that actually promote the use of exercises in storytelling. So, I mean, I guess inherently I believe in it. I just sort of get frustrated when I have to include it in things I don't want to include it in.
Yeah, because it's a skill. I mean, storytelling is a skill. So
Right.
I guess we need
Yes.
exercises
Right.
to
Yeah.
practice at least.
It's really just the type of person I am. If you're the type of person that reads a book and does what the author tells you to do in order to improve, you will love my exercises. If you're like me, I don't like to be told to do anything. The worst thing, my wife will say, if you want Matt to do something, don't tell him to do it, because then he's not going to do it, right? I'm that kind of person. So for me, exercises are things I deliberately ignore because I don't want to be told what to do.
I see. Okay. Um, Aude, our French teacher, asked, "How different is the approach between writing fiction and non-fiction?" I don't know if you've already answered this question like a minute ago, but are there any other differences between writing fiction and non-fiction for you?
Yeah, I mean, other than fiction, I don't know the end. It's discovery, and nonfiction is I know the end before I ever open my mouth. The other difference is when someone reads my novels, they expect me to create a world for them, a fully realized world, which means I'm going to describe a lot of things in a novel. When it comes to nonfiction, especially oral storytelling, but even sort of nonfiction storytelling, I don't describe much at all. People don't open up a storytelling book hoping that I'm going to describe a lot of things. When I start telling a story on stage, people are not hoping that I'm going to use a lot of adjectives. When it comes to nonfiction, people want to know what happened, what was said, what was thought, and what was felt. That's it, those four things. So everything else is just window dressing. It's just the stage upon which those four things can take place. So when it comes to nonfiction, whether I'm telling a personal story or even a book like Storyworthy, what I'm trying to do is access my audience's imagination. I say the word kitchen, but I don't describe kitchen unless I need to for some particular reason. I say kitchen, and I know that in your mind, you have a very clear picture of what a kitchen looks like. It could be yours, your parents, a kitchen you see on television, whatever it is. I don't want to describe the kitchen, and you don't want me to describe the kitchen either. No one's hoping I describe a kitchen. Instead, I say I'm standing in a kitchen, and you place me in a kitchen that you can already very clearly see. And that's really helpful to me. It saves the number of words I have to speak. And the power of your imagination is always going to be more powerful than any collection of words that I assemble. I will never be able to describe a kitchen with the clarity that you can already see. So in nonfiction, I don't use adjectives unless absolutely necessary. I'll use them for the sake of humor. I'll use them if something in the kitchen has to be described because it's relevant to the story. Otherwise, I rely on my audience's imagination. But people, when they read fiction, they don't want that. They want me to actually create a world for them. And I understand that. And so I do that when it comes to fiction, but still probably not as well as I should. Because I still think that when people finish a novel, no one has ever thought, boy, I wish he had described more stuff in that book, right? I don't think we open a book in hopes that the world is going to be well described. I think we open a book because we want to know what happened, what people are saying, what people are thinking, what people are feeling. We want suspense and surprise and humor and stakes. We want to be on the edge of our seats. We want to feel like the ending is both surprising and inevitable. We want all of these things. We don't want to know the particular color of the tree in autumn. We don't need to hear about the splashes of orange and yellow. I can just say it's October in New England and there's a maple tree in the middle of a field. And you're going to make it where those leaves are colored
Yeah.
because you know what an October in New England looks like. I don't need to describe it very much. So I avoid it when I can, certainly more in fiction, though. I do more of that in fiction than I do in nonfiction.
Also because the brain, I mean, this happens to me, the brain, when I see three adjectives before a noun, it's already, I mean, to me, it's already too much information. Like it's big, brown, and it's too much to process. Whereas one adjective would be fine.
Right. Well, the other thing is,
Yeah.
if you give an adjective, it has to be relevant because you're stealing bandwidth from an audience, right? So if I say, the woman with the beautiful blue eyes walks into the room, the blue eyes had better be relevant to the story because I've just stolen a little bit of your bandwidth. You're now going to have to remember she has blue eyes throughout the entire story, thinking that they're somehow relevant at some point. And almost always they are irrelevant to the story. I've never actually heard anyone's eye color be relevant to a story except for Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. And yet people talk about eye color and hair color all the time like it actually means something. And all it really does is steal away bandwidth. I'd rather say a beautiful woman walks in the room because you have your mental image of what a beautiful woman looks like, and that's fine. I'd rather say a teenage girl walks into the room. You know what a teenage girl looks like. If I want to say a teenage punk girl walks in, a teenage goth girl walks in, a teenage cheerleader walks in, you know what all of those things look like without me having to describe anything that they're wearing or carrying or looking like in any way whatsoever. So we have to be careful because when we are providing description, we're stealing bandwidth. We're requiring the audience to remember stuff. So the stuff that we're asking them to remember had better be important. Otherwise, they're going to be
Yeah.
frustrated at the end, thinking about things they don't need to be thinking about.
Let's say you wanted to write a book of your story, personal stories. So nonfiction. It's a nonfiction book, a collection of your own personal stories. Would you add all, because it's written, so it's not oral.
Right?
Would you add adjectives, or would you tell them, because it's a non-fiction story, would you tell them using, I'm in the kitchen, that's it? Or would you say, I'm in this big, large, and with, more descriptions attached to the noun? How would you
I
go
think
about
that
it?
I would be more likely to not use adjectives unless they serve a purpose. So if I was describing my childhood kitchen, there would be things I would tell you, but only in order to describe my life. So if I was describing my childhood kitchen, I would tell you that the counter has an enormous burn on it from the time my mother put a pressure cooker down on the counter. And it burned right through the counter. And we don't have enough money to fix the counter, so we just put a cutting board over the burn. And we have a dishwasher, but it's a dishwasher that you have to roll over to the sink and connect to the faucet with a hose because we couldn't afford to have a dishwasher put in like all of my friends. So in using those descriptions, I'm showing you what the kitchen looks like, but really what I'm telling you is the financial condition of my family growing up. So I would use those adjectives, but not simply as descriptors. I would allow them to expand on the story. And if they didn't expand on the story, I wouldn't say anything at all.
Wow, it's a writing technique, is it?
Yeah, well, I want my adjectives to mean something. I don't want
Okay.
them to just describe something, right? I want them to carry a message, a meaning, a theme forward. And if they don't do that, then I'm going to leave them out completely.
Okay. Artem, a teenager from Ukraine, he is a fiction writer, and he says, "What makes for a working, engaging plot in a fiction book?"
Well, that's interesting because I often don't start with plot, for the record. I almost always start with a what if question that results in plot. So for my first book, it was, what if there was a burglar in the world who broke into people's homes but only stole things that went unnoticed? So you never knew you were actually burgled because he was only taking things that you didn't care about. And he came back to your house week after week and continued to take things you didn't care about, right? You become his client. What would that be like? I didn't know what the plot of that book was going to be. That's all I started with, and I started writing. My most
Ah,
successful book, Memoirs of an Imaginary Friend, it's an international bestseller. It
I've
started
got
with
it
the
here.
idea
Yeah.
of, right there, yeah. It started with the idea of, what if imaginary friends are actually real? What would that be like? And that only started because I had an imaginary friend as a kid that I thought was real for a very long time. And one of my friends said to me, wow, that would make an interesting idea for a story, a book. And I actually disagreed.
Huh.
Well, it wasn't until my wife and my agent said it would make a good idea that I agreed to give it a try. But those are ideas without plot, and I find the plot along the way. I think in order to write something that is interesting, that has a good plot, we absolutely need to have care and concern for the
Hmm.
protagonist. We have to like that protagonist in some way. We have to believe in them, even if they're entirely different than us. We have to somehow have a rooting interest in who they are as a person. I think they have to be facing, you know, odds that seem at times insurmountable, whether that's an antagonist, a bad guy, or a self-created problem of some kind of their own doing that they now need to unravel on their own. There has to be there has to be an escalating series of issues that our protagonist is facing throughout the story. And there has to be hope, I think. There has to, whether the story ends well for the protagonist or not, because I don't think it has to end well. I think we can have stories where things don't end very well for our protagonists. There has to be hope that it might end well. And then whether it does or not is the decision of the author, and it often it depends on what kind of person is writing the book at the time and what mood they're in, honestly, at the time. But the audience has to see the possibility of success, whether or not that success is realized. So I think all of those things. But, I think most of the fiction writers who I meet, with the exception of mystery writers, sort of don't know what's going to happen in their book until they start writing the book. I spent a lot of time plotting out stories that went nowhere, because plotting out a story, absent character, absent momentum, absent the immersion of yourself in a world, oftentimes makes the plot feel very wooden and inauthentic. So I tell people, just start writing. Just find a character who means something to you, and that's it. And just start writing about what their life is like and what's going on in their day. And, through that process, quite honestly, I have always managed to find the right set of circumstances that lead me to a satisfying ending. And many, many writers write this way. You don't get taught to write that way, because people who teach writing are not actually writers most of the time.
Yeah, tell
There are
us more
people,
about this. Yeah.
yeah. Most people who are teaching writing these days are people who teach writing but don't actually engage in the craft themselves. And as a result, what they teach is what they imagine writers do, as opposed to what writers actually do. So, every high school English teacher that I ever had would assign me poetry but was not writing poetry, would assign me to write a fictional story, but they were not actually writing fiction themselves, right? Would assign me to write an essay, but didn't engage in the writing of that essay as well. And as a result, they don't really understand the writing process. And so weird things happen in English classes where, teachers tell kids, you have to finish something before you start the next thing, which is nothing any writer would ever do in their life. Most of the writers I know have multiple things sort of going on at once, so that if you get stuck in one thing, you can shift to another. Or quite frankly, sometimes you just don't feel like writing that thing today. And an English teacher would say, too bad, you have to write it. And that's a great way to kill a writer. So, they say things like that, or they think that the writing process can be delineated by stages. There's the pre-writing phase, and then the first draft phase, and then the revising stage, and then the edit. That's not true either. Like, I am writing and editing and revising and pre-writing. I'm doing it all at the same time. Sometimes I can't push something forward, so I go back and I revise. Sometimes I'm in a mood to do nothing, so I'll just edit. I'll just go and say, let me check my commas today. That'll be progress, even if I can't move my story forward. But if you don't write, and you don't write regularly, you can't expect the people who are writing regularly to listen to you. And you can't expect to really bring anything meaningful to the table unless you engage in the process. My favorite example of this was, back in I think it was the 1960s, a student in high school was being taught symbolism. And this kid, you can Google it, it's on the internet. He decided to ask writers, is symbolism really a thing? Because it just didn't ring true to him. So he wrote to about 100 American authors saying, is symbolism a thing you think about when you write? And the ones that chose to write back to them, almost all of them said, no, it's not a thing. We don't start by thinking, the white whale is actually Ahab's, desire to be. It's a whale. It's a whale, and he's a guy who wants to kill a whale because it bit off his leg, right? That's what it was. And what happens is, after we write our books, people who read our books come along and say, oh, well, look how he used the color yellow throughout the book so often. Yellow must be a symbol of something. Maybe he was just writing literally in a yellow room. And every time he looked up, he saw yellow, and yellow sort of sunk into the book a little more than the other colors. That's often what happens. But if you're not a writer, you somehow think that authors like me sit down and decide on the symbolism that is going to exist in our story as we begin writing. And none of that is really a thing for almost all the writers in the world. And yet that is what gets taught all the time. So we have to almost, as writers, unlearn the things that we're taught. And one of the things I try to teach people right away to unlearn is the idea that you actually have to have a plot to begin writing. You have to know where to go, that you have to have a graphic organizer or an outline. No, just start. Just choose a character who means something to you. You don't even have to know much about the character, My first character, Martin, I didn't know anything about him except he wanted to break into people's homes, steal things, and not get caught. That's all I knew about him. And I started writing, and he revealed himself to me through the act of writing. And that works for a hell of a lot of people. But most people aren't told that.
I I was on I was doing a course on masterclass. There's this famous writer in the U.S. who wrote all the Goosebumps. You know, the horror.
Yes, R.L. Stein.
R.L. Stein, exactly.
Yes.
I read all of his, not all of his books, but when I was a teenager, I read a lot of those in Italian, and I loved them. I loved them all. And he says that he outlines everything. Like, he first writes the full outline of what happens in the beginning, what happens next, and I thought, I don't know if I can do that, like outlining every single thing, and then that's the hard part, he says in the course. And then I'm like, and then he says, it's easier after that because I know where I'm going. But you're saying another thing, so I'm wondering, is there one right way to write? Like, well, no, there's no one right way to write. Maybe
No,
just
there isn't.
preferences, just
Right.
preferences.
And I think that some types of writing lend themselves to certain strategies. So R.L. Stein, for example, Goosebump books, right? They're mysteries, essentially. And I said mystery writers tend to outline because mystery writers can't sort of find the solution to the mystery. They have to know what the solution is before they begin so they can start laying the clues and the red herrings all along the way. They have to do all those things. Goosebump books also tend to be a little formulaic, right? They're all sort of like, they follow a similar pattern, right? Yeah. And so if you're reading books that follow a similar pattern, outlining makes a lot of sense to me because the first book is going to be kind of like the next book. Not like the next book, but following along the same road, let's say. Yeah. My books, every single book is entirely different. It's one of actually the problems with selling my books, according to booksellers, is I'm not a thriller writer. I am not a mystery writer. I'm not a romance writer. I'm a person who writes a novel that is entirely different than the last novel in so many ways, right? I wrote a novel based entirely in lists. It's just list after list after list that tells the story of an obsessive list maker, right? But I'm not the guy who writes list books. I wrote one. So for people like me who are sort of not writing formula or not writing books that are very similar to the last book I'm writing, or people who are just trying to write their first novel, I think you should probably at least give it a chance. Just start writing and see what happens. Admittedly, there are people who have to outline, and there's nothing wrong with it. John Updike said he always knew the last sentence of every book he ever wrote. I don't know if that's true, but I think what he's trying to say is I kind of knew where I was going the whole time. And I think that's great. It does not work for me. I can't imagine where I'm going in fiction. But if it works for you, that's wonderful. But if it's not working for you, if you're having a hard time, it took me 5 years to figure out outlining does not work for me. I wasted 5 years because no one suggested to me, maybe you should just write and see what happens. I wish someone had told me that earlier on, but they didn't because they weren't writers. They didn't know what they were doing.
I see. But in oral storytelling, the end, right? Because you say, I know the 5-second moment. You talk about the 5-second moment in Storyworthy, right. So the end.
Because it's actually happened to me. It's already happened. Yeah. I'm not inventing, exactly. Right? I'm not inventing anything. I'm just looking for meaningful moments. That doesn't mean along the way that I have to, there's choices to be made. Like, if I'm telling a story about my son being disorganized, I need 3 examples probably to show you how disorganized he is. I have 50 to choose from. I have to choose 3. So there's still choices to be made. But once I know what I'm aiming at, many of those decisions become pretty clear to me because it's already happened. I don't have to make anything up, so I can know what the end is.
Okay. Adriana asks, any advice on self-editing when revising manuscripts?
Self-editing?
Self-editing when revising manuscripts.
Well, I don't know what that means exactly, other than
I guess it's self-editing when you've got your draft. This is how I interpret the question. You've got your draft, and then you start editing the draft, like removing words, moving things around, that kind of thing.
Got it. Read it out loud is my suggestion. Read your draft out loud. Everything sounds lovely in our heads. It doesn't sound so good when it comes out of our mouths and our ears hear it. We don't actually hear anything that we read in our minds. Like we don't engage in that act of listening because we don't engage our ears, and therefore we don't engage that part of our brain that utilizes our ears to hear things. And so quite often I write something that sounds really beautiful on the page in my head, and then I read it out loud and it sounds incredibly clunky. So I would say read it out loud, and for me at least, I send everything I write out chapter by chapter to about 10 people. And they
Oh,
read my books as I go along, chapter by chapter. And I choose my people carefully. Originally, when I wrote my first book, I just chose 10 people who agreed to read. Now I have a list of about 50 people who are often willing to read my books. So I choose about 10 based upon their skill set, based upon what they're good at, what the book is about, that kind of a thing. I like to know my score at all times. I like to send a chapter out and hear whether it landed well or it did not land well. I don't want chapter 8 to be a failure and then end up, writing the whole book and discovering that chapter 8 is a problem and it created a whole bunch of other problems along the way. And
huh.
so I like an audience to sort of be giving me the thumbs up and going, yep, keep going. It's working out well for me, and occasionally that doesn't happen. Occasionally I'll write a chapter and people say, a whole bunch of my readers will say, this makes no sense to me. And if it doesn't make sense, I don't want to continue because there's probably something broken in the story at that point. So I like that too. Not everyone's willing to do that. Most of the writers I meet think I'm crazy to be sharing a book in progress like that, but that is the way I've always been.
Okay. Yeah, feedback for a writer is like, how do you know if one thing is what? Sometimes I write something and then I show it to my partner, and it's just like, this is too short, or there's not enough here, and I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't think about
Right.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. You need other people. I mean, don't let them guide your fiction in that they're telling you what should happen next. But you do want to know if they're still entertained, they're invested, do they care about the character?
Yeah.
Do they want to hear the next chapter or not? Those are questions you can certainly be asking.
There are a few quotes from Some Days Today. Do you still have time? Like, can we go for, I
I
don't
do.
know. Yeah? Okay. Maybe
Yeah.
10, 15 minutes?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
You've got this quote. I've got 4 quotes from Some Days Today, and I highlighted a lot of things in Some Days Today. A lot of things. But here they are. Maybe we can discuss these. Wait a second. Creation is hard, you say. It is messy and ugly and fraught with struggle and failure. It's an oftentimes miserable journey littered with cast-offs, botched experiments, fitful starts, unmitigated disasters, and utter failures. Um,
Yeah.
okay.
That is true.
Yeah. How did you experience this? Or
Oh,
what does it
every
mean?
day.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
mean, all the damn time. Whether I write something or I record a video or I, do something in my business or help someone in their business, there's mistakes made all the time. I write that because so often people who want to create something expect perfection from themselves. And the moment they have failure, the moment they receive criticism, they sort of shrink and decide that this is not for them. My wife and I, we do a podcast that's actually been on pause for a couple years now, but we're going to get back to it soon. We recorded about 120 episodes.
Which I've listened
And
to them, all of
oh,
them. Yeah.
we're getting
Yeah.
ready to launch again.
Great.
But when we started it, it was funny. She was very hesitant. And I didn't
Mm.
understand why, because she MCs our shows. She stands in front of hundreds of people. I thought, what's the big deal? We'll sit at the dining room table and record. And we had recorded about 10 episodes. And then I showed her the feedback that we were getting, in iTunes and all these places. And it was all incredibly positive. And she breathed an enormous sigh of relief. And I said, what's the deal? And she said, I didn't want to do the podcast because I was afraid that people would hate what we were doing and we would get lots of negative criticism and I wasn't going to be able to handle that. And I always remember that because essentially if I hadn't forced her to podcast with me, she would have been afraid to because of the possible criticism we would have received, right? She
Yeah.
saw that creative process as it might not be perfect. And if it's not perfect, I don't want to do it, Thankfully now, now sometimes if we get a negative review, she doesn't care because we have 150 positive reviews and 2 negative reviews. So she's able to sort of balance that in a really effective way. I always go into projects not really caring what other people think, just trying to do my best. And letting the chips land where they may. And I've always just been that way. I kind of don't care if I fail because failure is part of the process. But my wife didn't feel that way, and I think most people don't. And so I'm trying to let people know, if you're creating something, whether it's a painting or a business or a book or a shoe, or you're planting a garden in your backyard, whatever you're doing, there's probably a good chance something's going to go wrong. And there's a good chance that everything's going to go wrong. And there's a great chance that nothing will come of it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You have to acknowledge that there's a lot of failure in the process of making something great. And I think most people are afraid of that. I think they're looking for perfection, and they're always looking to the perfect and not noticing the imperfect around us, and how that is perfectly acceptable too.
Well said. Yeah. It's why you say the only real failure for any creator is to stop making stuff. That's
Right.
another quote.
Yes, that is absolutely the only failure, because if you fail 1,000 times and on the 1,001th time you create something extraordinary, you're a hero. You've done it. You're victorious, and everyone forgets about the 1,000 failures. My daughter is obsessed with film right now. She's autistic, so she gets really obsessed with things. She's an expert on films right now. And she will often tell me, she'll say, this director of this great movie, his first 4 films were flops. And
Oh,
it turns out that she knows that because she's obsessed and she reads constantly. But most people don't know that their favorite director produced 4 terrible movies before anything good. Like James Cameron, famously, his first movie was Piranha 2, which was a ridiculous and terrible movie that did not succeed. And yet he is one of the most successful filmmakers today. And most people have forgotten about Piranha 2. And even if they remember it, they sort of chuckle at it as his first little step into the business. But had he been thinking, I need my first one to be Titanic, so therefore I cannot do Piranha 2, right? He never would have done anything. So,
yeah.
People forget your failures when you finally have a success. And actually, people don't even care about your failures most of the time. They notice the failure and then they continue with their life. They don't think about you
Exactly.
very much at all.
Yeah, that's so true. So liberating. And this is, yeah, you also say, had I not allowed myself to write poorly, I never would have had the opportunity to write well.
Yes. Yeah. I remind
So,
people, I have written every single day of my life without missing a day since I was 17. Since November 28th, 1988, I have not missed a day. Now, not every day has been a blog post, but it's been a letter. It's been, it's been a diary entry. I have drawers and drawers of journals that I was writing every day. And if I look back on the writing of my early days, it is not good. It took me 17 years to publish my first novel after beginning to write relentlessly. So it took me 17 years of practice before someone said, this is worth publication. I did a lot of bad writing before I finally did something that someone was willing to pay me for. So, I could have
wow.
quit along the way a long time ago, but I just continued to write, knowing it's something I like to do. There's a possibility of a future in it. I'm creating, permanence and legacy for myself. Even if it never publishes, my children someday will have a record of me. My mom passed away in 2007, and I have 2 things that she ever wrote, 2 bits of handwriting. One is a recipe on a card that she wrote to me, and the other one is a book of poetry she had as a 16-year-old girl that she wrote in the margins in. That's all I have from my mother in terms of writing. No real understanding of how she thought or felt on a deep and personal level. My children will not suffer from that. Their problem is, Dad, you write too much stuff. We can't keep up with you. Great. That's a wonderful problem to have. So even if I had never published a damn thing, I'm still doing work that's going to mean something to people in the future.
Brilliant. And you say also that you've never suffered from writer's block.
Right. Yes. Writer's block comes from the idea that you're only allowed to write one thing at a time, or that you can only write one type of thing at a time. So a great example is this morning.
Mm-hmm.
I got up very early, as I always do. I sat in front of my computer. I'm supposed to be revising a book. It's actually a month late. They haven't asked for it yet, so luckily I'm still okay. but I'm supposed to be finishing my next book. But when I sat down this morning, I just wasn't feeling it. I just
Okay.
thought, I don't feel like doing this today. So instead, I wrote 3 letters. I wrote a letter to my daughter's principal, thanking her for a wonderful thing that she did. I wrote a letter to an author, telling him how much I loved his book and how much I appreciated it. And I wrote a letter to the Speaker of the House in the US, telling him he's a terrible man. I wrote those 3 letters this morning, and I wrote a blog post, right? So I wrote a blog post and 3 letters instead of what I was supposed to be writing. But the point is, I didn't suffer writer's block because I had something to write, and if it wasn't going to be the 3 letters or it wasn't going to be the book, right? I'm also writing a list of advice for children growing up around the ages of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I could have gone to that list and looked at the list and said, which rule do I want to expound upon, or which lesson do I want to expound upon? There's always something for me to be writing next. So writer's block doesn't exist for me because I just afford myself the opportunity to write something different in a variety of genres as well. The other morning, my wife was upset with me because I keep leaving the garage door open at night, and she thinks someone's going to get into our house through the garage door. And so I left it open, and she was annoyed with me. So I wrote a poem explaining why I forget the garage door. And it has to do with the way that she distracts me with her beauty, and therefore I can't remember the garage door. That was my writing one morning, right? So I afforded myself the opportunity to write a poem. So if you're suffering from writer's block, I always say you're not writing enough things. Just find a
Hmm.
different thing to write. Because in the end, writers are in the business of connecting sentences. That's all I'm looking to do. Ultimately, I want to produce something that is complete, that makes sense to people, that can be enjoyed. But at a surface level, on a daily, hour by hour moment, I'm attempting to connect sentences in meaningful ways. And that is how I managed to become a successful writer, by simply connecting sentences. So as long as you can find a way to connect sentences and make meaning from those sentences, it doesn't matter what you're actually putting on the page. It could be anything. Just keep writing.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for this. I was wondering why letters and not emails?
I like physical letters a lot. I set a challenge for myself every year, or an expectation, that I'm going to write 150 physical letters that I will put into an envelope, affix with a stamp, and send somewhere. I think it's a I think it's a wonderful thing to receive a letter. It doesn't happen very often in our lives. So, like,
Yeah,
quite
never.
literally, next to my right here, I always have cards, envelopes, a list of people I want to write to, and stamps, always ready to go. So if I had sat down here 3 minutes before this interview was to begin, I would have taken my pen and I would have written a letter, probably to one of my students, about something they had done wonderful last week, and then I actually mail it to the kid. And the first time one of my students get a letter from me, they think it's crazy. They're like, "Why are you writing to me at my house?" But the parents tell me they hold on to those letters for years, because there's a big difference between getting an email that you
Yeah.
can delete and a physical letter that you can leave lying around a desk, on a refrigerator, in a shoebox. So I love writing physical letters to people. I just think it means a lot. Now, I don't always handwrite a letter. The letter I wrote to the principal this morning was typed and printed. But the letter I wrote to the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, that was actually on one of these cards. It was on one of these cards because it didn't require me to write much to tell him how I felt about him. So, I like a physical letter whenever possible. I'm well over 200 this year. So I've written over 200 physical letters that I have mailed out to people. The other thing is, people write back to you because they can't even believe you've written. They're so astounded that a letter has arrived. Like, wow, you wrote a physical letter to me, that quite
Yeah.
often people will write back to me in really meaningful ways. So that's a wonderful thing too.
The last letter that I got was from my mom when I moved to Australia. She was writing this. It wasn't a letter. She just grabbed a page from a notebook and she started writing. And I still have that, and I will always remember that letter. I will always have it with me. It's in my wallet, and it's just it's physical. It's like reading on an e-reader and on a book. Like the book it exists in the real world.
Right.
An email doesn't really. In a
Right.
letter, yeah,
It also signals a certain degree of care and attention that you have offered it. It's
yeah,
very easy to write an email on your phone while you're sitting in the car waiting for your daughter to come out of a dance lesson,
hmm,
right? But to
hmm,
actually take a pen or type a letter and print it out and physically sign it and address an envelope and affix a stamp to it, it tells the person who's receiving the letter that I cared enough to send it. Even if it's to Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, I cared enough to put pen to paper to tell you how upset I am, right? So at least even in that case, he can't simply delete the email and ignore it. He'll throw it away for sure, but he'll know that someone spent time and money and effort to let him know how I felt. And I just feel
Mm.
like every time you do that, it adds weight to the thing that you are trying to say, meaningful weight. And, 95% of the letters I write are kind remarks. The letter to the principal that I wrote this morning is a very kind email thanking her for something that she did. The letter to the author was very kind, telling him how much I loved his book, and about 5% of the time I write to people who I'm very angry with, and those are fun to write too.
I should write a letter to the person who manages here the building. Yeah, thank you for the to say how much I dislike what he's doing, but that's another story.
Yeah, right. Even like my
Yeah.
wife and I went to brunch this morning, and I added to my list. We went to brunch this morning. The server at brunch was fantastic, our server. So on my list, I got the server's name. Her name was Joan. And I'm going to write to the restaurant and say, on this day, we came for brunch, and Joan was really lovely. She really made a wonderful breakfast for us. It was really great. And Joan's going to feel great about it, and the restaurant's going to feel great about it, and the person who owns the restaurant is going to be thrilled to have Joan working for him. Like, it's just going to have a huge impact, and it's going to take me 5 minutes to write it and 2 minutes to send it out, and it's going to mean something to another person in a really wonderful way.
Yeah.
I teach my students to do it too. One of my students just recently wrote to an ice cream place in town, and we sent it out, and she said basically, I love your ice cream. I wish my parents would take me there more often. And the ice cream place wrote back to her a letter that said, we're so happy you like our ice cream place. We've included $20 in gift cards, so the next time you want to come, you can tell your parents it's on you, right? Really smart of them, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes I tell the kids, sometimes nothing happens when you write, and that's okay. And sometimes you write and you just get some kindness in return, whether it's a response in a letter or something even more special, like for a 10-year-old kid, $20 in gift cards to an ice cream place. Like, the class celebrated it, and that kid's now going to become a letter writer. That kid's going to see the value in communicating in the written form to people in the world, especially when those letters are unexpected. I always tell kids the unexpected thank you note is the best thank you note. When you get a birthday gift, everyone expects you're gonna a thank you note is fine. It's whatever. But when you thank Joan the server for being excellent at brunch, that's an unexpected thank you note. The punch that packs is extraordinary. So whatever you're doing in writing, as long as you're connecting sentences, that's great. And if you can make a little beauty in the world in the way I did today and tomorrow and all those days, that's a great thing too.
I have one last question. I say to the people who watches these videos and this little channel that I have, I told a story about how I wrote a tiny book. I call it a tiny book, 80 pages. It's basically a collection of my own personal stories on how I learned English, because I'm an English as a second language teacher. And I published this book, and people got inspired. It's not a best-selling book, of course, but I said, look, you can write a tiny book. You don't have to write like what Matthew Dix writes. What advice would you give to people, to aspiring authors, like people who have never written anything, like they've never not written anything, published any book, but they want to self-publish maybe a book? What would you've already said a lot of things, but maybe, I don't know, if you have a special thing that you would tell them.
I would tell them to not be precious about the way that they write. I think far too often the thing that keeps people from writing and thinking they're going to write someday, whereas someday is today. Yeah. I think the thing they think is that they have to wait for just the right moment, and that will never come. So somehow people think, I'll take a sabbatical, I'll write when I retire, I'll write on vacation, and I tell people I write in the cracks of my life. Literally, I just told you that, like, if I had sat down 3 minutes early, I would have written a note, right? Because I have everything in the place to do it, because I'm not precious about these things. So I write in 5 minute increments and 25-minute increments. And I get up in the morning and, sometimes I'd have an hour or two to myself sometimes. But I think people are always looking for the perfect opportunity. I actually meet people who say, well, I can only write between 10 and 2. I have to write in a coffee shop. I need smooth jazz and a cappuccino. And I always remind those people that during World War I, there were men in gas masks hiding in trenches while bombs were exploding over their heads. And they were scribbling in notebooks with a pencil and paper, hoping to someday, if they survive this war, publish something, back in their home country. Thank goodness they didn't require a Starbucks and a latte and smooth jazz, because no one would have ever written anything. So this weird preciousness that people have about they can only write at a certain time, they can only write in an hour at a time, like all of this is just nonsense. You're basically just making excuses for not wanting to do the hard work. Everyone wants to have written something. Few people are actually willing to write something. So you have to be willing to just begin now, even if you have 2 minutes to yourself. Write 3 sentences. A book is a collection of sentences, somewhere between, let's say, 1,000 and 10,000 sentences. And so if I can write 3, that gets me closer to the end. And that's the way I think about it all the time.
And I guess this is how you think about all the projects that you're involved in. Like I guess that you think about stories. You don't sit down and say, okay, now I'm going to write a full story beginning to end, and I won't get up until maybe, because there's another quote, maybe I can read this. It is wrong to buy into the myth that the creative person is singularly focused on a defined end product. Yeah, does it tie in with what we're saying here? I think so.
Yeah. It's the idea that people think that when I sit down to write a book, that I know exactly how it's going to end, what it's going to yield, where it's going to be published, what bookstores it's going to be in. No, I'm just trying to make a thing. And sometimes when I'm making that thing, it takes a left turn and it becomes a new thing, becomes a different thing, and that's all fine. Very often the act of creation is a spark that leads us somewhere, but the somewhere is often undefined, or at least it's sort of in a general vicinity, but the specificity of the landing place is often impossible to see. So, most creative people are not simply sitting down and writing their book. Most of them have a job and a family and maybe another job and chores to do and a dog to walk and cats to feed and beds to be made and laundry to be done. And in the middle of all that, they're writing a book or growing a garden or inventing a shoe or, whatever they're doing, sculpting. So often I just think people see authors as like people who put their foot up, and it's 9 a.m. with a cup of coffee and they start writing and then they take lunch and write a little bit more. There are those writers in the world, but there's not that many of them.
Yeah.
They're only the best-selling ones. The rest of us have to eat. So we actually have to do other things in order to feed ourselves until the next book comes out and, perhaps carries us through for a while. So don't think creative people are singularly minded. We have a lot of things in our lives and we have to make room for creativity.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. So inspiring. Some days today, Storyworthy. I'm going to now read Story Cell. I bought memoirs of an imaginary friend, but I haven't read it because I cannot bring myself to fiction yet at this stage of my life. And I don't know. I mean, I know why. I'm interested in real stuff.
I understand.
But I will read this.
You bought it.
Yeah.
That's great. I like it when people buy my books. It's nice when they read them, but it's pretty great when they buy them too. So thank you.
Yeah. Where can people find you? Like, where would you like to direct them to your website, which you've changed? Like, it's brilliant now. Like, it's it was good before as well, but now it's more interactive.
I didn't change it. I hired someone to change it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But yes. If you go to matthewdix.com, or if you go to storyworthy.com, if you're singularly focused in storytelling, both of those places are good places to find me.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you.
Yep. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Thank you for watching. If you're a writer and you want to improve your writing, or you want to keep improving your writing, consider joining my private email list, Better Writers. I send one short email every week. I share tips, insights, things that I learn, book recommendations to help you do one thing only: become a better writer. The link is in the show notes or in the description of this video. Thank you for listening once again. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.